Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Bonnie Lin. I am the Director of the China Power Project and Senior Fellow for Asian Security at CSIS. We are very delighted that you can join us this afternoon for a panel on the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. This timely panel on the Quad will focus on how the Quad positions itself in the Indo-Pacific and the Quad's relationship with China and Taiwan. Since the Quad's founding in 2007, it has evolved and increasingly been responsive to a number of regional challenges. In the last year, Quad leaders had two key summits where they advanced cooperation on a wide range of issues. This included, for example, ending the COVID-19 pandemic, cooperation on infrastructure development, as well as partnering on critical emerging technologies. As we look forward, one of the key issues the Quad will face, given its commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific, is how does the Quad respond to an increasingly assertive China? So I'm incredibly fortunate today that we are joined by three leading experts and amazing panelists. And the panelists will discuss and the three panelists will provide varied perspectives on the Quad. The first one will be discussing it from the Quad from the US and Japanese perspective. And we have Dr. Mike Green, who is Senior Vice President for Asia, as well as Japan Chair from CSIS. And we're also incredibly fortunate to have Ms. Susanna Patton. She's joining us from Canberra, Australia, very early morning for her. She is a research fellow for the Foreign Policy and Defense Program at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. And last, but definitely not least, we have Mr. Rick Russo, a senior advisor and our Wadhwani Chair and US-India Policy Studies at CSIS. Rick will be presenting the India perspective on the Quad. So Mike, Susanna, Rick, thank you for joining us to share your expertise today. Before we get started, let me thank the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office for making this event possible. Also, on an administrative note, I would like to encourage our audience to take a moment to find the function on your screen where you can submit live questions, which we'll be asking during the Q&A portion of the event. So let me start things off by turning it over to Mike Green, who will give us the US and Japanese perspectives on the Quad. So Mike, to help kick off the discussion, how would you characterize how the Quad has defined itself in terms of addressing challenges in the Indo-Pacific? What position so far has the Quad taken on China and Taiwan?
Well, explicitly, the Quad has avoided those topics. The Quad sort of goes by the Theodore Roosevelt mantra of speak softly and carry a big stick. And in fact, the origin of the Quad that we see today was unrelated to China or Taiwan. It was in the aftermath of the Boxing Day, December 26, 2004 massive Indian Ocean tsunami. And I was the senior official in the White House and the National Security Council at the time and remember it well. What happened was basically the US 7th Fleet was steaming across the Indian Ocean, and the commander had good relations with his Indian, Japanese, and Australian counterparts, and suggested back to Washington that we consider a quadrilateral joint task force to provide humanitarian and disaster relief to the stricken areas from Sri Lanka to Aceh and Phuket. And it was the fastest I've ever seen government move because it was between Christmas and New Year's and most of the US government was on vacation. So we were really lean and efficient. And within less than 24 hours, Canberra, Tokyo, New Delhi, and Washington agreed to stand up this task force. And the main purpose was to provide public goods, was to rescue people and save lives in South and Southeast Asia. And it was an open architecture. The Singaporeans, the the United Nations, Korea, New Zealand, and eventually China participated in this provision of public goods. But the reason it appealed to the governments at the time in the US, Australia, Japan, and India was that it showed the power of maritime democracies working together. And now this was over 15 years ago, and we were not as alarmed at China's rise as we are today, but it was in the back of all our minds. It was the reason why pulling India in was so important to the Bush administration strategy, and it really began at the end of Clinton before that, to broaden the players as China's ambitions and power grew, to reinforce a rules-based, what we now call free and open Indo-Pacific, not by containing China, but by providing public goods and showing that these four maritime democracies can work together. And the interesting thing about the Quad with its revival under President Biden, and well, really before that under President Trump, actually, because it's very bipartisan now in all four countries. The interesting thing is the highlights, the headlights are vaccine provision, and supply chain issues, and again, providing public goods, reinforcing in a free and open Indo-Pacific rather than containing China. But of course, the subtext, the big stick, is the reality that these four navies, the US, Japanese, Australian, and Indian Navy, are very, very powerful. And although never explicitly stated, will secure maritime routes if forced to. That's the unstated message, which is a pretty powerful dissuader for China if it thinks about using force.
Mike, thank you. You mentioned the role of the four navies in the Quad in terms of where the Quad could potentially go. To what extent, from your perspective, is there desire from the United States to encourage the Quad to be more forward-leaning on China or Taiwan?
Well, it's interesting. After the Indian Ocean tsunami, Victor Cha and I were on the NSC. We wrote a paper for Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor to the President. He read that as a speech at the Australian Embassy in 2006, and Shinzo Abe in Japan, who was preparing to take over as prime minister, got a copy and made it a campaign pledge that he would have a Quad summit. And that was a little too rich for all four countries. It was a little too ideological. It was a little too much about China. And in the 2007, 8, 9 period, the winds blew against the Quad, particularly in Australia, but also in Japan, India, and the US. And there was no ambition, actually. The Obama administrations, the Rudd government, Australia, Fukuda in Japan, and even the last few years of the Bush administration, there wasn't a lot of appetite for this maritime alignment, which critics called neocon, overly ideological containment of China. China fixed that problem, and particularly in 2020 with the attack, which Rick can speak to, in Ladakh against Indian forces, a violent attack that changed the Indian temperature on this and made India a much more willing driver of the Quad. So the ambition in some ways depends on the demand signals in terms of the need for public goods in Asia, where these four countries can play a leading role, but also in terms of how much China uses coercion. So it's a rheostat. The more China is pressing, the more these countries are going to do things together, not explicitly against China, but to reinforce the rest of the region against possible Chinese coercion, and to provide public goods and help states be more resilient. I think that's the dynamic we're seeing. So ambition, yes, all four countries will do more. How much? A lot of the answer is going to depend on Beijing, I think.
And Mike, just to follow up on this, has the Quad specifically talked about Taiwan, or how's Taiwan played in from where you're seeing in terms of the Quad discussions or Quad initiatives in the Indo-Pacific region?
I mean, in the early days of the Quad, in the midst of the tsunami crisis, when it was a joint task force, or in the early 2006-7 dialogues about the Quad, Taiwan was not a major factor. I'm obviously not privy to the ongoing discussions behind closed doors, but I would be very surprised if Taiwan today is not a major topic of discussion, because I think there's a growing concern in all four countries, but particularly in the US and Japan, that the possibility of coercive force being used by Xi Jinping against Taiwan is growing. May still be low, but it's growing. And I think there's also a growing recognition, not only by the four Quad countries, but also others, that Chinese coercion against anyone in the first or second island chain implicates all of us, affects the security of all of us, not only because over half of seaborne traffic goes through the South China Sea, because Taiwan is Japan's critical flank, but because of what it would say about Chinese intentions vis-a-vis the Indian Ocean, or the Himalayas, or Australia, or the Pacific Islands. The signal it would send about Chinese intentions is what really is catching people's focus. 74% of Japanese now say that Japan should play a role in helping defend Taiwan. In US public opinion polls and the surveys we did at CSIS, there's a similar trend in the US. My sense is, Susanna would know better, that's true in Australia as well. I don't think India is looking to play a role in the Taiwan Straits. So it's really going to be the US and Japan at the core, with Australia at the next outer ring. But that said, I think there's a growing sense among all four countries that coercive security threats from, Djibouti to Guam affect all of us. And I think there's probably a lot more dialogue about this than there was 15 years ago.
Thank you, Mike. That's a great transition to looking at the Quad from the Japanese perspective. So from your understanding, and I know you focus quite a bit on Taiwan and have very strong connections with the Japanese government, where does Japan see the Quad in, say, 3 to 5 years or 5 to 10 years in the future? What is its vision for the Quad? Is it more of playing is the Quad playing a more of a role in terms of providing public goods, or is it expanding beyond that? Are there any specific roles that Japan envisions the Quad as we move into the future?
There's not a lot of pushback against the Quad in Japan right now. We just had an election in Japan, and before that we had a race for the presidency of the LDP, the ruling party, in which most of the candidates endorsed the Quad. The Quad has a good image in Japan, and it's for the very obvious reason that Japan can't handle China alone. China's gray zone activities around the Senkakus and circumnavigating the Japanese islands has been on a steady increase. Back in 2005, when we first responded to the tsunami, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces were roughly comparable to the PLA Navy in size. Now they're about a third of the PLA Navy. So just the logic of balance of power has made the Quad really compelling for the Japanese political leadership, but the public at large. I mean, the opposition party on the left, the Rikento, the Constitutional Democratic Party, is softer on China, is not as in favor of defense spending as the ruling LDP or some of the other parties, but they're not against the Quad. The Quad is external balancing, working with others, plays well now in Japan. So I think there's bipartisan support for the Quad. The pacing issue will be resources. How much can the Maritime Self-Defense Forces do Malabar exercises? How much room is there to cooperate with India when we also have, in Japan's case, the G7, the G20, the trilateral security relationship with the US, Japan, and Australia? So it's the pacing factor really is resources, I think, rather than some ideological or foreign policy debate in Japan right now.
Thank you, Mike. We talked quite a bit on the military side. Could you, in terms of at least Japan's positioning of the Quad, is there also a strong economic component of it? How much does Japan attach to, for example, the cooperation on emerging technology, cooperation on infrastructure? I just loved for you to talk a little bit about those aspects of the Quad cooperation from Japan's perspective.
We're talking about the Quad because it was a summit and it's an organizing framework, but there's all kinds of cooperation: US, Japan, Australia, Japan, India, US, Japan, India, that is happening around the Quad, that's sort of being subsumed within the Quad now, but all started around the same time. In 2005, not only did the tsunami happen, but that was also the year the US and India agreed to a new strategic partnership, and to help India with its peaceful nuclear industry, to recognize that India was not in the non-proliferation treaty, but we would keep them in the non-proliferation tent and work together. And after the US endorsed that, Japan and Australia quickly came in. And so Japan began, for the first time in 2005 and 6, really exploring the relationship with India. And India went from a very low level of development finance from JBIC over official development assistance coming from Japan to India to being the #1 recipient with the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor and all kinds of infrastructure investment. Makes a lot of sense for Japan. India is a partner that Japan neglected for decades, that shares a common concern about China, but also the economies have a lot of natural synergies, if you think about it. And so the Japanese government and industry have been, they have all the complaints about India that Rick can catalog that the US or Europe have, but it's since 2005-6, about the time the Quad started, Japanese economic relations with India have really picked up. There's a natural synergy there, and it's bipartisan. You know, even when the DPJ was in charge in Japan, although the Quad blew hot and cold in the last 15 years, the Japan-India relationship just kept growing. Very logical, security, diplomacy, and economic.
Thank you, Mike. One final question for you before I turn it back to Susanna. In terms of where you see the Quad going, as well as how you were talking about the Quad, it seems like what you're suggesting is Quad provides a very large umbrella in which we could have these quadrilateral activities that all 4 members engage in, but we can also have trilateral activities, bilateral activities. So it's not so much, we shouldn't necessarily view Quad activities as just the 4 members. Is that a correct characterization of how you view the usefulness of the Quad?
I think the beauty of the Quad, when we first established it in the aftermath of the tsunami in 2005, was that there was no standing secretariat. There was no treaty. It was 4 like-minded maritime states that could do this together and show the power of our alignment. And I think that's still the animating spirit for the 4 governments. Suzanne and Rick can speak to this for India and Australia. I think in the US and Japan, first of all, 4 is enough. You start adding more and you dilute the sense of purpose. But I think there is a real appetite for, Quad plus, for a la carte participation by Canada or New Zealand or Korea or France in specific supply chain security, Malabar exercises at sea and so forth. And I don't think there's an appetite to create a kind of standing secretariat or the institutions of a treaty, a mutual security treaty like we have with Japan and Australia, for example. I think the flexibility inherent in the Quad structure is one of the advantages that allows the 4 countries to turn it up and turn it down and have agility when they think they need it. And that reflects the larger diplomatic architecture in Asia. You have these big pan-Asian agreements. You have Apec, for example. You have RCEP and CPTPP, which the US sadly is not in. But increasingly over the last 20 years, you've had minilateral and plurilateral groupings, the US, Japan, Australia, trilat starting in 2001, the Quad. And that's because it's not Europe, it's not NATO. Countries trade a lot with China. They don't want a collective security organization like NATO that will go too far in alienating China. So a lot of the diplomacy and security cooperation in Asia, it's founded on core alliances like US, Japan, US, Australia alliances, bilateral alliances, but a lot of it is pickup games. And I think that's sort of what the Quad represents. And the US, Australia, Japan, and India show up in the basketball court every Saturday morning, know each other well now. But from time to time, if New Zealand wants to play, or Canada or France, come on in. I think that's sort of what it's going to look like.
Thank you, Mike. That's a great transition to Susanna to share her views on Australia. So Susanna, first question I have for you is, how does Australia view the role of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, particularly given the existing regional organizations and agreements that are already there? For example, ASEAN, Five Eyes, AUKUS. Where does Australia view the Quad as fitting in this regional map of this regional architecture that already exists?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question and for hosting this event. I think it's kind of difficult to predict the sort of the future of the Quad and how it will evolve, given that it has evolved already so much more rapidly than many people expected, and that, as Mike said, that's very much being driven as a response to China's behavior. But I think sort of to describe maybe a little bit about the way that Australia sees the Quad, I just wanted to refer to a document that Australia released last year, which was a really important strategic policy document called the Defence Strategic Update, and it set out a framework for the type of things that Australia needed to do in its region. And that framework was shape the strategic environment, deter actions against Australia's interests, and respond with credible military force when required. So shape, deter, respond. And I think it's a kind of useful framework for thinking about some of these questions, because I think for Australia at the moment, the Quad very much falls into the shaping category. So Australia wants to use the Quad to shape a more favourable region. And in particular, I think, Australia is conscious that Southeast Asia, which is a region of great strategic importance to Australia, is changing very rapidly, and there's a real need for the Quad to, to send a powerful message to China in particular that it's not going to have its own way on regional questions. And the Quad does that just by existing, just by the fact that we have strong, cohesive joint statements from the 4 countries and other important signals from the countries in terms of intelligence cooperation, maritime security cooperation, and so on. And so the way that that's kind of described in an official sense, in the kind of declared objective, if you like, is as a positive partnership. Positive is the word that you'll hear Australia, and I think all 4 countries use over and over again about the Quad. It's a positive partnership, and it's about delivering practical public goods to the region. And so Australia, I think, has a strong focus on tangible delivery, on actually delivering on the commitments that the leaders have made to this point, and on really demonstrating that the 4 countries can work together. So it's still, I think, at that kind of proof of concept stage. And the vaccine initiative and other initiatives that have been announced are really important in that regard. In terms of how it fits with other institutions, I think, when it comes to deterrence and to responding to threats and challenges from China, I think other forums are going to remain more important than the Quad in a direct sense for the foreseeable future. And I think from Australia's perspective, the trilateral security dialogue involving Australia, US, and Japan would be particularly important, but also Australia's bilateral alliance with the US. The Quad is probably potentially play a longer term role, but at the moment, I think Australia very much sees it, as I said, more as a force for sort of shaping the region as it currently exists.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up here on the Quad and how that relates to ASEAN, just because I've seen a lot of discussion there, and I know this is a topic that you've covered quite a bit. Could you talk a little bit about, is the Quad in any way disruptive of ASEAN effort, or is it, as you mentioned, a very positive contributor of public goods and it in no way conflicts with ASEAN?
So I think it will be seen in different ways in different parts of Southeast Asia. And I think that's something that Australia and I think Japan as well will be very conscious of, is about ensuring that complementarity with other institutions. And it really is a question about balance. I think certainly as I understand it, the Quad, if it were carried too far and it became too great a proportion of the focus of what Australia was doing in the region, or indeed of the other 4 countries, I think it could wrongly convey the sense that the 4 countries believe that the security of the region and the future of the region is something to be decided from the outside rather than from the 10 countries of Southeast Asia. And that would be really, really damaging to Australia's standing, to the standing of all the 4 countries. So I think there is a real consciousness of the need to find that balance. And I think that matters a lot to Australia because of the strategic importance of Southeast Asia. So I think, my sense is we're still, the Quad is relatively new, and we're still in search of that settling point and that way that we'll understand how the Quad relates to ASEAN and other groupings.
Thank you. In terms of this balance that you're talking about, how do we reconcile the Australian need for having a balance between for example, investments in the Quad versus other trilateral, bilateral investments in the region, with where Australia sees the Quad in the next 5 or 10 years. Could you talk a bit about what you know or what you assess might be the direction that Australia would like the Quad to take?
Well, Australia has been very enthusiastic about the Quad, and after the Quad Virtual Leaders Summit earlier this year, the Australian Prime Minister described the Quad, and this is a quote, as the most significant thing to have occurred to protect Australia's security and sovereignty since ANZUS, and he's referring there to the signing of Australia's bilateral defence treaty with the US in 1951. And for anyone who knows about the, I suppose, the reverence with which the ANZUS treaty is treated by Australia's politicians, that's an incredibly big claim, right, about the importance of the Quad. But I think even so, it is going to remain, as Mike said, one of a number of groupings, and especially if we're talking about Taiwan in this context, and the more hard-edged deterrence and military preparations and discussions, that's something that's very much, I think, going to be occurring within the context of the Australia-US bilateral and also the trilateral security dialogue for the foreseeable future.
So Susanna, you mentioned Taiwan, and we had talked a little bit about China. Could you share with us where your assessment of Australia's views on China and Taiwan are? Would Australia, for example, be supportive of being more forward-leaning in terms of Taiwan's defense? Or is there other factors that Australian policymakers have to take into consideration when assessing its relationships with China and Taiwan, and how forward-leaning Australia might be encountering Chinese assertiveness?
So I think it's pretty clear that because of Australia's alliance relationship with the United States, were we to face some kind of Taiwan contingency in a sort of worst case scenario, I think there can be little doubt that Australia would be involved in some way because of the, for example, the joint facilities that we host with the United States in Australia, and other aspects of our alliance cooperation. And there has been some reporting to that, some media reporting to that effect, to suggest that that those sort of discussions and considerations are going on within government in Australia. But I think, public opinion in Australia probably, I think, hasn't fully caught up with that reality. I think, Australians, there's been quite a bit of discussion about Taiwan and the risk of conflict in Australia, but it's always been in a more abstract way, as something that would be between China, Taiwan, and the US. And I think there's been less understanding of how Australia would be involved. And public opinion, I think, reflecting that, isn't really there in terms of supporting Australia to be involved. From the recent Lowy polls, for example, I think the last time this question was asked directly was last year, and only 36% of people supported, favoured supporting the US in a Taiwan contingency. And in 2021, 57% said they wanted to remain neutral in a US-China conflict. That wasn't specific to Taiwan, but that was general. I think those 57% of people are probably in for a disappointment, because it's very unlikely that Australia would remain neutral. That's just not likely to be realistic given our alliance relationship with the US.
Thank you, Susanna. We'll come back to some of these points on Australia during the Q&A. So let me turn to Rick to share his perspective on where India is with the Quad. So Rick, some have characterized India as the Quad's weakest link. What are your views on India's commitment and its involvement in the Quad to date?
Thanks, Bonnie. Well, I guess I always got to start off with a Rodney Dangerfield impression, no respect when talking about India, whether it's trade or security or other things. I think from Delhi's perspective, they might point the finger in other directions. They're worried, that rhetoric that Australia was too deeply tied to trade. The United States administration, sort of goes back and forth. So I don't think India had confidence that all the other members were necessarily ready to really put their shoulder to the wheel. Probably Japan being the exception to that. So I think that India didn't want to be the first, and they weren't sure that others were necessarily ready to join. Notably Australia, and there was problems that the two countries had bilaterally. But But I think overall, India under Modi, who came to office in 2014, has unilaterally picked up a more confrontational approach to India or to China. Notably, with his own swearing-in ceremony, his first day as prime minister, from somebody who was a state leader that really didn't have a big role in foreign policy, had some light China engagement, trying to encourage trade and investment with China as a state leader, but really we didn't know exactly where his position would be on foreign policy. And that swearing-in ceremony, the world got excited because he invited South Asian leaders and seeing him with then Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, and people hoping and that you'd see peace in the subcontinent. But Beijing was far more concerned about the fact that the Prime Minister of the Tibetan government in exile was also invited, akin to a state leader, and that kind of riled things. And so didn't get as much attention. I think most of the world was focused on Pakistan, India, but for Beijing, that other signal was at least as important as kind of saying. A couple of critical things changed, apart from India's own kind of stepping out. Number one is China's aggressiveness, and as I hinted at before, India and Australia really have done tremendous work bilaterally to improve the relationship, which has really kind of opened up things on the Quad. In particular, as Mike noted, for the United States, we've made these major sweeping steps like civilian nuclear trade. I mean, nothing could have opened up Delhi's eyes that Washington was thinking about the relationship differently than that one monstrously spectacular thing that we put on the table. For Australia, it's been a lot more broad-based. And for those of you that care about like international relations with India, if you haven't read India's, the Australia's India Economic Strategy to 2035, that was shepherded and pulled together by the former Foreign Secretary, Peter Verghese, it's well worth reading. It's a monstrously long document, but just chock full of big ideas and suggestions on how Australia can improve its relationship with India. So watching those two countries come together, I think, has been instrumental in seeing the Quad come together. Now, overall, again, Modi has been more confrontational in his personal approach, apart from what I mentioned about the Tibetan Prime Minister in exile coming to the swearing in, sending the Indian Army to defend Bhutan's border when China was attempting to rewrite the undemarcated area and seize chunks of Bhutan's territory, which continues to this day. India was the first country, well ahead of the United States, to call out the Belt and Road for ulterior motives. They avoided the first Belt and Road Summit, and frankly, were being ridiculed in some corners for giving up potentially lucrative contracts that everybody was kind of hoping would flow from this. So they started to carve out, I think, a pretty good unilateral strategy. The U.S. relationship has really kind of taken off, and the India relationship with Australia. So a lot of elements apart from China's own aggressiveness, I think, that came to fruition all around the same time.
And Rick, can I ask, so you mentioned a while back there was some concern within India about how committed other members of the Quad were to the Quad. Do you still see those same concerns in India now, or has that changed in the past year or two?
No, I don't sense that there's any concerns of that whatsoever anymore. I mean, what we've seen from Australia coming to grips with how deep China had gotten there, Japan, I think, has been in it from the get-go. I think seeing successive U.S. administrations with very, very different political bases agreeing, you saw with the pivot, you saw with the Indo-Pacific, you saw with the Quad, and to be that elevated and sustained in the Biden administration, through the Trump administration, starting, even before. I don't sense those concerns are there anymore for India with any of these countries. Now, look, democratically elected leaders in all four, the ability for a quick change, it's there on the table, including in India. And I think when you think about elections and change in purpose, if Modi does not win future elections, he's up for re-election in 2.5 years. What happens if he loses? If it's a coalition of some of these regional parties in India, if Congress comes to office, we really haven't seen regional parties show much interest in these big global issues that we're debating today. And Congress, when they were in office recently, although it'd be a different leadership now, really wasn't willing to be quite as aggressive. So I would say the one country that may be a little bit more political at risk, because you just haven't seen transition between parties and keeping up the same level of momentum, would be India. But again, hope that's not the case, and we really don't have a lot of test cases for it yet.
So just to make sure I understand that correctly, so in contrast to Mike's description of the, I guess, the support for the Quad across the Japanese political parties, we're not necessarily sure where India might be if we have a leadership transition.
Yeah, just not sure. I mean, it's all come up. We haven't had an election, and so it's difficult to see. So I'm not saying I don't think it would happen, but probably if you have a coalition of some of these regional parties in India, that in times past when they come to office, they're just looking to scrape together what they can for their region or their home state. That would probably be the most difficult scenario for maintaining momentum from India's behalf. They may not cut themselves out. They may not abandon it. But it's still a very young organization and still has a lot to grow. So if India tries to put at least a pause on carrying out these existing working groups and kind of building its mandate, that would be seen almost as walking backwards. So yeah, there's potential dangerous scenarios out there.
Can I ask, in terms of where, at least Prime Minister Modi, where he views the Quad in, say, 5 or 10 years? Because Susanna had mentioned the Australian view of the Quad. There was some consideration of the need to balance investments and efforts on the Quad with trilateral relationships, bilateral relationships. Is there a similar concern or calculation on the India end of striking the right balance and where the Quad might be?
Mm-hmm. Well, first and foremost, and I'll link it to Indo-Pacific concept. When the Trump administration came out and talked more openly about an Indo-Pacific strategy, the Indo, I think, caused a lot of folks in Delhi some pause. Excited, but at the same time, what does the Indo mean? Indo can be taken two ways. In the first case, it's a word ploy to try to drag India into the primary battles we look at: South China Sea, the cross-strait relations, the East China Sea. So was the Indo really referring to India and trying to pull them into the Pacific theaters of tension that we saw? Or was it, in fact, the articulation that we would build out the strategy to include the Indian Ocean? And that's where India's interests really lie. And I think over the last 4 years, with the Trump administration and into the Biden administration, you really begun to see the United States bilaterally with India, and hopefully through the Quad, carving out more of an Indian Ocean forward-leaning strategy. India, has had really an uncontested position as the dominant military power, the dominant naval power in the Indian Ocean, but that's changing over time. China wants to grab more than a toehold in that region, and India, thinking out loud long term, realizes that it continues to lose ground on China economically and militarily. And if China makes a concerted push into the Indian Ocean, controlling strategic infrastructure, long-term operations of Navy, can India stop them if called for? And that's where I think India now realizes that it needs partnership more than ever. More than happy to rebuff the United States and other partners and kind of be the big brother to its regional neighbors on land and throughout the sea. But that calculus has changed in Delhi. And so I think when we think about the evolution of the Quad, over the next 5 or 10 years, thinking about a strategy for engagement in the Indian Ocean and making sure that that is a secured place where India remains the dominant power, shared with friends. That I think is India's main goal, and that kind of speaks to what the Quad is focused on so far. Although you've got the on-balance sheet stuff, the working groups and everything, and the off-balance sheet stuff like the Malabar naval exercise. So they're still saying this is a non-military partnership, but that concept is actually well suited. When you look at what China is doing in India's neighborhood, it is mostly, commercial or semi-commercial investments in strategic infrastructure. And when they build Gwadar Port in Pakistan, when they built and took control of Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, they're attempting to gain a foothold under the previous government in Maldives. These are all initiatives that are done, at least ostensibly at the outset, for commercial interests. But again, if they can't pay bills, if China gains control, could they begin using that for military purposes to conduct long-term operations? It's not too hard to imagine. And so I think what you see with the Quad right now on, just launching the infrastructure initiative, for instance. So I think for India, the 5 to 10 year window focuses a lot on Indian Ocean, and it focuses a lot on non-military cooperation, because if we had a joint strike force of the 4 navies patrolling the Indian Ocean, what are they looking for? There is some, Chinese vessels that do go through, but it's not really an active theater of military operations right now. It's more, quasi-commercial operations that China is really looking at. So I think, what they're talking about right now, the working groups are well suited for what India sees in its neighborhood. They just want to make sure that its action area, does include the Indian Ocean very significantly.
Thank you, Rick. I want to pivot a little bit and ask you, given the increasing Indian concern about China, whether it's activities on its border or in the Indian Ocean, could you talk a bit about what are India's views on Taiwan? Because I've read some of Indian scholars seem to be saying that given the tensions with China, that India might think about strengthening its relationships with Taipei to have that Taiwan card to play. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, there's some natural synergies, with Taiwan, with its, looking south, and we did a small project looking at the significance of India's services and creative economies, which was fascinating to dig into. I would just say, if I'm speaking to Delhi policymakers on this topic, I would say be prepared to take Taiwan's lead. Keep your ears open, let Taiwan take the lead on this, because what we've seen too often, is countries trying to use Taiwan as a chip for negotiation and bargaining or something like that. So you don't want India to make some big announcement on, we want to build relations with Taiwan as a signal to China or something like that, without Taiwan eager and ready and interested to take up areas of cooperation that India may pose. India is trying to build a much larger manufacturing sector. They're trying to move in some of the technology areas that Taiwan's been very good at. You're always unwilling to give too much of your commercial to a partner, but there is some area there where things that Taiwan is really good at are the things that the Modi government has circled that they want to get good at. So no question that there's real areas of complementarity, but I would just simply counsel India, let Taiwan take the lead on this. Because they're going to know the level and pace that is probably most comfortable, because Taiwan's got a lot more at risk at a miscalculation in terms of striking out new directions than India does. And so, be wary and be open to outreach that Taiwan does is my big advice to New Delhi.
Great, thank you very much, Rick. With that, let me turn now to the questions that have been submitted. And let's try to, we have quite a number of submitted, so I don't know if we can get through all of them, but we'll try to cover as much as possible. So a subset of the questions that were submitted relates to Quad and Quad Plus and how the Quad's relationship with particular countries. So I wanted to ask any of the panelists if you wanted to jump in. So one question is there a role for France in Quad Plus, given the recent dynamics with AUKUS? And the other asked about what is the role of the Quad and its relationship with South Korea. Maybe I could turn first to Mike to see if he wants to jump in on any of these questions, and then to either Rick or Susanna if you have any additions too.
Well, there's a big debate in the Korean government about whether or not to participate in some aspect of the Quad. Korea has been under Chinese economic embargo and coercive pressure like Australia, but where Australia stood up to the Chinese pressure, signed AUKUS and changed legislation. Korea's kind of kept a low profile and tried not to be too openly confrontational with Beijing. But 70% plus of Koreans in polls now say they think China's a threat. So there's some pressure building in Seoul to consider whether maybe on an a la carte basis, a frigate and an exercise, cooperation on supply chain security, they should maximize their friendships and partnerships the way Australia has done. France, I think, was heading towards doing more with the Quad. The AUKUS deal, which obviously angered Paris, probably chilled the momentum, but it would make sense for France to be involved. They have a frigate on station most of the year in the Pacific Island. They sent the Charles de Gaulle carrier battle groups will be periodically going to the Pacific, just like the Queen Elizabeth from the UK. I think European countries that are leading military and diplomatic powers like Britain and France are looking, and Canada for that matter, are looking seriously at ways to cooperate with the Quad. Not to join formally, but to demonstrate, what the Quad shows is willpower. It shows willpower. It shows an ability to invite China's anger and a willingness to take that heat to stand with other democracies that are concerned about China's coercion. And, a growing number of countries think they have to do that. And the Quad is flexible enough to allow them to participate without formally joining. And I think you're going to increasingly see that, because as Xi Jinping goes into the 20th Party Congress, he is not putting on his Mr. Nice face. He is playing primarily to domestic audiences and demonstrating that he can safeguard China's sovereignty. And he's getting tougher, not softer. And so I think he's going to drive more countries through various kinds of a la carte cooperation with the Quad as one of a series of pickup games these countries can play to both cooperate with China, signal disfavor with China, cooperate with like-minded states. Asia is a messy architecture, but the Quad is going to be a place where I think you see more middle and smaller powers looking to signal strategically where they are.
Thank you, Mike. I just want to see if either Susanna or Rick want to jump in here, or we can move to a different set of questions.
No, that's good.
Okay, great. Another set of questions we have are with response to whether there might be concerns within the United States, Japan, Australia, or India about how China might respond to the Quad. One particular question asks if there is a fear of encirclement in India with Pakistan and Myanmar expanding their relations with China as a response to both, China-India dynamics, but also the Quad. Rick, let me turn this to you to see if you had any thoughts on this.
I think the opposite. India has fairly well encircled China. With its relationships with Japan, building with Vietnam, the United States, and other partners. I mean, I'm kidding halfway when I say that, but this was a major reorientation, and I think it kind of shook Washington a little bit when, and not just Washington, but Southeast Asia. India announcing this look east and then act east, but not really seeing a lot of actions to kind of follow that up. And it's really because, again, when Modi came to office, back in 2014, he looked at his own neighborhood and realized that almost every single country with which India shares a land or maritime border had better relations with Beijing than they did with Delhi. Delhi had set its sights on going these non-aligned summits in Southeast Asia and things like that, and they really lost a time and attention for maintaining good relations in its own neighborhood. So you've seen real concerted efforts on Sri Lanka, which yielded some results, positive and then negative again. Democracies, they flow up strange elections sometimes. Securing support for democratic forces in Maldives to bring in a government that is less pro-China than the one that existed there before. Better ties with Bangladesh, better ties with the civilian government in Myanmar for a bit there. Nepal, some success in defending Bhutan's territory. So you've really seen a concerted effort to kind of rebuild the neighborhood. So I wouldn't say encirclement. You've actually seen this, it's a relatively weak organization, but the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SAARC. SAARC members, when tensions between India and Pakistan began to flare, and there's supposed to be a SAARC summit coming up, most agreed to pull out because, because Pakistan had been supporting terror organizations that have been striking out against Indian interests. And so, I would say at this point, yeah, you got a cat and mouse game where both of them are trying to secure alliances on each other's borders. I wouldn't say India feels necessarily encircled, probably more concerned about that in the maritime space than the land space. And actually in the land space, they've been able to use it in their own favor. But they have made some efforts, similar to when Modi saw China building relations with a lot of India's neighbors. If you look back at some of Modi's first foreign trips, when I said about encircling China, one of his first trips that he took was a two-stopper to Mongolia and to Korea, two democracies where India hasn't had a lot of relations, but certainly Mongolia is looking for friendly partners, two monster borders with China and Russia. They're always looking for anybody else that'll show up and offer some level of cooperation and assistance. It hasn't really been sustained because, again, India is kind of refocused on its neighborhood. But so it is a bit of a cat and mouse game as each of them try to tie up partnerships. But, India's focused on the direct neighborhood, and they've had some success there so far.
Thank you, Rick. A lot more questions on India that I will circle back with you in a second. But first, over to Susanna. One of the questions, actually a couple of questions, very similar, were about what does AUKUS mean for the Quad? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the difference between AUKUS and the Quad, and if there are any conflicts between the two. I don't think so from my perspective, but I keep on seeing a number of questions in our chat pitting AUKUS against the Quad.
Yeah, sure. I think on AUKUS and the Quad, like you say, I mean, they really are, two completely separate arrangements. One is a defense technology sharing agreement between, two close US allies and the United States, and the other is a much looser diplomatic network of a much more diverse, I guess, range of countries in terms of their security relationships. So, I certainly don't think there's any conflict. I think what they do have in common is that they're both about an effort to, on Australia's part, in different ways, to be part of a more robust balancing coalition against China. So, the Quad does that in a diplomatic sense by partnering more closely with the other three countries on a range of issues, and AUKUS does that by providing Australia with an improved military capability. We hope that we'll see Australia, positioned to play a more robust role. So I think that's really the similarity. I did just want to come in on the question that was raised before about China, because I think, it's no longer a major concern for Australia that, about China's reaction, simply because China has already pulled so many of the levers that it had in terms of economic coercion, cutting off diplomatic contact with Australia, and so on. But I think, one area of concern and importance for Australia in that respect is in terms of understanding US objectives and US-China policy, because from this administration, we've seen that there's a really big emphasis on partnering with allies in terms of the response to China, but I think we still don't really have a good sense of what is the administration's ultimate goal in terms of China policy, or indeed Indo-Pacific strategy, because we're still yet to see the Indo-Pacific strategy, for example. And so I think, from Australia's perspective, if we're going to be part of these kind of more robust balancing approaches towards China, it's really important that we have opportunity to seek input into those policies as they're being formed, and to really have a strong understanding of how they're evolving, because that then enables us to manage our own China policy as best we can.
Thank you, Susanna. I wanted to fill another question from the audience, which goes back again to India, but it touches on India from a variety of angles. So one of the questions was, is there a path for a more formalized defense relationship between the United States and India on a bilateral level? And the second question is would the United States, Japan, and Australia welcome India to APEC or draw India into more economic relationships? Let me turn to Rick first, but also welcome Mike and Susanna if you're interested in chiming in.
Yeah, on the APEC one, I'm sure they will. I don't know that everybody wants India necessarily in organizations like APEC. India hasn't even shown a lot of interest. It got pretty popular there in a bit for sort of the India crowd to talk about India inclusion in APEC. But look, there's a variety of steps India can take as good faith measures, joining some of the working groups where you can join as a visiting country and that kind of stuff, which India's chosen not to. So the pathway for India to join, India could take a lot more of that on to kind of show earnest interest in APEC, and hasn't really done so. So I think the biggest obstacle to joining isn't so much what other countries support. India hasn't really shown a lot of interest, apart from the fact that, in the last 6 years, you've seen India withdraw from trade integration and those kind of things. So I think APEC, it's a really high hurdle. I think India's got to show interest first, and every doorway that's been opened up, they'll put in a statement that they're interested, but all the work streams they could launch that would begin building the case, they haven't taken. So I think interest has got to start with India, and before others get excited about the idea, and it hasn't really begun in Delhi. In terms of formalizing U.S.-India defense relations, look, I mean, if we're talking about a mutual security treaty, I would not say never. A lot of people would say never. I think the threat perception has got to be dramatically higher for India to consider that. But if you're talking about formalizing the defense relationship, as the question was posed, it is happening. We are signing what we call enabling agreements that allow all the technical areas of cooperation on logistics, on communications technology, geospatial technology. We have opened up the door for Indian liaisons at Indo-PACOM, at AFRICOM, at Central Command. India has opened up for an American liaison at their Information Fusion Center in Gurgaon. So, the way the question was posed, it is absolutely happening. The United States is India's largest partner for exercises. We're becoming one of the larger providers of military equipment. We've launched new programs to share technology more aggressively than we've done with other partners. But if it's a mutual defense treaty, which I'm pretty sure that's what was underlying the question, it's not even on the cards. I think threat perceptions have got to go to a whole different orbit before it's going to be seriously considered. But, you know, I'd never say never. Things can get a lot hairier over the next 10, 20, 50 years. So let's just not quite put an exclamation point on a never on that one.
Yeah, if I could, Bonnie, I think that's right. Never say never. A lot of people predicted in 2007-8 the Quad was dead, and it's now, I think, in many respects, the most important feature of you know, American, Japanese, Australian, and Indian foreign policy strategy right now. So never say never, but there's some big obstacles to a more formal U.S.-India defense pact that are not resolved, and in some ways are getting worse. There's India's traditional unaligned approach to the world, strategic autonomy. That's manageable. You know, Australia too talks about strategic autonomy from time to time. Harder to manage are Pakistan. The United States is going to need a relationship with Pakistan to deal with the terrorist threat in Afghanistan that's emerging. And Russian sales of high-end equipment to India, particularly surface-to-air missiles, are a huge obstacle to U.S. selling high-end equipment. And there's no sign that India is going to back away from that. Rick would know better. So in bits and pieces, from the intelligence relationship to exercises to liaisons, it's a growth relationship, but it has too many obstacles to being, you know, approaching what we have with Australia and Japan. On APEC, look, when India pulled out of RCEP because it didn't want to do the relatively easy trade liberalization involved, I think it put a big, it was a big bucket of cold water on the idea that APEC was a good idea with India. I don't think you'll get a lot of enthusiasm in government in Australia or the US or Japan, to be honest, for now. Which, if I can make one last point though, you know, we're talking about alignment and cooperation and agreements, but strategically for the US, Japan, and Australia, I would argue the most important thing India can do is sanitize the Indian Ocean, is make sure that India remains a net exporter of security, so that if we do have a crisis in the Western Pacific, the PLA Navy cannot transit with impunity the Indian Ocean. That if India can secure its own neighborhood, that to me is the big prize. And fortunately for us, that's exactly what India wants to do. That's a pretty good basis for us strengthening the security relationship without a formal defense treaty. I see Rick nodding, so I think I got that one right. Thanks.
Mike, I also want to see if you wanted to weigh in on, I think Susanna had mentioned the, I guess the wanting clarity in terms of US goals for the Indo-Pacific, if you wanted to weigh in on that at all.
Well, I mean, I think when the Indo-Pacific strategy comes out, Canberra is going to be very comfortable with it. And the kind of flavor of it, you can already see in a, I think it was Foreign Affairs article that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and Kurt Campbell, the Indo-Pacific Coordinator, did about a little over a year ago, which basically called for competition with China without catastrophe. And, you know, with the Trump administration, there was competition, but maybe there's some questions about whether some people in that administration also hoped for catastrophe. And so I think this is going to be very comfortable for Australia. I think the part where Australia will rightly be dissatisfied is economic statecraft. You know, I don't think you'll see any plans to join CPTPP or play a major role in rulemaking in Asia, which a lot of us at CSIS and around town are criticizing the administration for. But in terms of how to frame competition, focusing on allies and partners, but trying to maintain a relationship with Beijing that could be productive, maybe even more productive in the future, my guess is the parameters will be very, very comfortable for Australia. And in some ways, Australia is the alpha test. If we can't convince Canberra with our Indo-Pacific strategy, we failed at the get-go. And I think they'll generally succeed. Though I hope U.S. Studies Center will beat them up on their poor economic statecraft.
Thank you, Mike. I wanted to ask one quick question to Susanna, and then we'll wrap this up by just going around the room to see if there's any additions from any folks. So Susanna, one of the questions from the folks was, you know, prior Australian leaders, not all of them have been supportive of the Quad. To what extent do you see there is now support for Quad across the political spectrum in Australia?
I think the support for the the Quad will be very strong now. And I think, you know, I've obviously already talked about the China factor in driving Australia's interest, but I think the other major one that maybe I didn't mention explicitly is Australia's long-standing interest in wanting to see the US play a role in the Indo-Pacific that is as, you know, as constructive and active as possible. And Australia has a long history of using regional institutions to embed the US role in Asia, going back to Apec, as has been mentioned. And so the Quad, I think, will very much continue to be part of Australia's strategy in that sense.
Great, thank you. Just one last question for everyone, simple yes or no. One of the questions from the audience was, is it safe to assume that the Quad has now evolved to be a foil against China and its activities in the region? So let's just go across the room to get a simple yes or no. Maybe start with Rick, and then Susanna, and then Mike.
I'll give it a yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, I guess so, yes.
There's so much more you want to say than just yes or no. But
Well,
yeah.
it's tricky to give a yes no answer to that question, but you know, I don't want to take any more time.
I'd say yes. I mean, at a minimum, it's complicating Chinese assumptions and ambitions, which so if it's a binary choice, yes, you get 3 yeses.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susanna, Rick, and Mike. This is a great panel, and my apologies, everyone, for going over 1 minute, but thank you for staying with us.
Thank you, Bonnie. Well done. Cheers, buddy.
Thanks, friends.